It's John Gierach that says his choices have always been for more time and less money, and that's kind of, I think, what we've done.
That's our motto.
Can you imagine being the fly fisherman who was this summer standing in Cobbessy Stream where it enters the Kennebec River? He looked around his feet and saw a sturgeon up to 10 feet long going right by his feet as he was fishing there.
One of the things that certainly defined my childhood was just time outdoors. So that was where we focused all of our time as kids and just throughout my young life, adventuring and exploring in the woods and the fields.
They're so precious, I would really refrain from killing any of those fish, mostly because I have such a deep respect for those fish and how valuable and what a precious resource we have here in Maine.
Welcome to the Flyline Podcast, where we enjoy the interesting stories behind the legendary guides and luminaries connected to Maine fishing. I'm Michael Jones. Today, we're thrilled to bring you part 2 of our podcast series with fly fishing historian and author Leslie Hilyard. In this episode, we focus on one of Maine's most fascinating fly fishing pioneers, Herb Welch. Leslie, along with his father Graydon Hilyard, co-authored their book on Welch in 2018, illuminating the life and work of this multi-talented artist, taxidermist, and innovator in fly tying. The Hilyards unearth remarkable details about Welch's groundbreaking contributions and his unique connection to the history of the Rangeley region. Leslie will take us behind the scenes of their research process, sharing how they pieced together Welch's story and his influence on Maine fly fishing culture. We'll also dive into a riveting mystery involving Welch and the unsolved murder of Otis Bean, a story that adds an unexpected twist to Maine fly fishing history. Beyond Welch's legacy, Leslie reflects on the artifacts and exhibits preserved in the Outdoor Heritage Museum in Oquossoc, Maine, which stand as a testament to figures like Welch and Carrie Stevens alike. These treasures not only keep their stories alive, but also inspire new generations of anglers and historians. As always, Leslie's insight and passion for preserving the heritage of fly fishing are at the heart of this episode. It's an honor to have him back to share his expertise and experience with us. Leslie Hilyard, welcome back to the Flyline Podcast. So Leslie, before we go down the Herb Welch road, I just want to introduce the audience to who Leslie Hilyard is. What brought you into this orbit of Maine fly fishing?
Well, like so many children, I was brought here by my parents. But leading up to that point, I grew up in a town called Ashland, Massachusetts. And it was a lovely, lovely place to grow up. Right out my back door was a spring-fed brook. And my parents moved to that home when I was 7.5. And there were brook trout in that stream. And I'd never seen it before, and I got enamored of those. And then a short walk through the woods was a state park, the Ashland State Park. And that had a reservoir under construction, and that was going to help feed the burgeoning water demands of Boston. But then the Quabbin and Wachusett, those are our big reservoirs down home that feed the city. Those projects were underway, and this one was abandoned after it was completed, but never tied into the water system. So here's this gorgeous hundreds of acres lake that supported a fishery. And as was the norm, the sun came up, you all ran out of the house with, a Pepsi wrapped in tin foil and a couple of bananas or peanut butter sandwiches. And you went out and you spent all day in the woods. And that's what we did. We had canoes stashed around the lakes, go to the rope swings. We would always fish. And I really enjoyed the fishing. The act of fishing was fun, but coming into contact with the fish and being able to study the fish really captivated me. I was really interested in the natural world. Later on in life, I would be a biology student, a wildlife biology student in my failed college career. But we grew up where we grew up, and by no small twist of fate, the man who lived next door to us was this old French-Canadian guy named Fred Torrance. And he ran a bait and tackle shop called Fred's Aquarium.
Fred's Aquarium.
Fred's Aquarium. And he ran it out of his basement. And then a few years after we moved in, he actually added an addition onto his house. And that became like a proper shop, right? And he sold, all the tackle you'd ever want, except for fly gear. and he had a big live minnow tank, and you sold, all the crawlers and all the terminal tackle that you would need. And there was a pack of us kids in the neighborhood, and he would pay each of us a nickel a crayfish if we brought him crayfish, and a quarter a frog. So a quarter went a long way at the Tasty Treat ice cream stand just down the road. So we would spend our days going frogging. And if you had a really good day, you'd get a hot fudge sundae out of it. Didn't have a good day, you'd get a small sherbet cone. But, those were tough times. And, but Fred was really great, and he was super nurturing in this way. He was wicked funny, old codger, like 6'2", massive, bulky man, crew cut, fake glass eye. He'd take it out and he'd polish it with this filthy handkerchief from his pocket and pop it back in front of you just to freak us kids out, smoked camel strings. Just a real indelibly etched in my mind.
But he was feeding you're the young men.
But this was the thing, he gave us a purpose and some fun, and we would always buy night crawlers and minnows from him. It worked out well for him. And I was off in the woods one day at the state park, and there was a gorgeous, 300-yard long granite dike that they built to hold back the water. Massive granite blocks, big granite blocks, 3 by 6 foot blocks. And I was watching the guy walk across the dike one day, and he was fly cast. And I'd never seen anybody fly cast. I didn't know what he was doing. I didn't know the term. I didn't know what it was. I knew nothing about it. And I'm about 9.5.
Impressionable.
Sure, but curious. So I ran up to this strange man in the woods and said, "Mister, what are you doing?" He says, I'm fishing. I know. I go, "Oh, well, I'm fishing too, but I don't know what you're doing." He goes, "Oh, I'm fly fishing." And he handed me the rod. He goes, try it. So he had just finished a cast. So he's got 50 feet of line up. Well, that didn't end well. But he was really patient with me. And all I remember about him is his name was Jerry. And he was an older guy. He was probably in his mid-50s, if I can assume.
He was an older guy. He was in his mid-50s?
Yeah, my age. And he was really patient. So he handed me the rod, and he let me have at it. And he brought in a bunch of line, and showed me the mechanics, how to essentially try to get it done.
He was teaching you how to fly fish.
He did.
Yeah.
He did right there. He snapped off a bunch of flies, and tying them on. He was fishing professors and wet flies. And then, that ended, and I would run into him occasionally, and he let me ask, try it again. I went home and I told my dad about it, and he's like, "Oh, no kidding. That's really fascinating." And I said, "Yeah, I really want a fly rod for Christmas." So this was like August, and I got a fly rod for Christmas, and I fished like hell. And the next year I got a better fly rod, and my father got one too. He got himself one.
Well, you mentioned at one point that you took to fly fishing before your father did.
Yeah, I did. It's kind of odd in that regard. That classic patriarchal format. All my knowledge to you, my hair. Yeah, well, it didn't happen that way.
It didn't happen that way.
He fished. My father taught me how to fish.
Yeah.
All manner of spin fishing and bait fishing and bait casting and all of that. But we just didn't fly fish. Where he grew up, they didn't do it.
That's exactly how it went for my situation. I learned to fly fish before my father did as well. And I think actually my interest got him interested maybe in the same way your interest got your father did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It worked out really well. So we kind of embarked on that particular journey together. And I was a rabid reader. I read all manner of England books. Joe Bates was my mentor at the time. Every periodical that hit the newsstand, Outdoor Life, Sports Afield, Field and Stream. And we just all absorbed them. We're all there the day they were supposed to hit the rack. And, I read about the Rangeley's.
And then your dad brought you to Rangeley.
And then we came to Rangeley. And I think it was 81. And, I couldn't get enough of it. So in our previous conversation about Mrs. Stevens did one thing incredibly well. Herb Welch did almost everything he touched incredibly well. In regards to the fly fishing, of course, you can't start any conversation there without how important he was as a guide and as a fly tyer and fly designer. He was like a casting champion. He had a sporting goods store. And those are just strictly the fishing things. But whenever and this is the problem with her, where Carrie was kind of a monoculture.
Yes.
Fly tying. Herb is just so vast. I mean, there's so much stuff we couldn't include.
So when was Herb living? When was all this going on?
Herb passed away in 1960. And he was here at Haines Landing right at the beginning of the heyday, right around 1900, 1910, right in there, that whole era. A lot of this was still being built. And he was from downstate, Portland, I believe, to start, and came up here. He was working for Aurelius Hines, the taxidermist, and they had a shop down there, and then Herb went out his own. And then, Hines decided to move back to Portland, where headquarters were, and he sold his thing to Herb, and Herb just kind of got his foothold here and started making his way. And it's art. The use of the word, it's very broad. It can be used as a very broad term. Certainly, craft done artfully is its own subgenre of art. And I think fly tying is a good example of that. People say, oh, you're an artist. And I'm like, not really comfortable with that term. I think a craftsman or craftsperson is a better use of it. It's a debate.
It's a matter of...
But Herb's, you have Herb's fly tying, but then you have his true art calling. He was a carver. He was a sculptor. He worked in oils and watercolors, pastels and charcoal. He was classically trained. His work hung in the Louvre. He just produced one after another really important pieces of art, from wildlife art to landscape to portraiture. We worked in bronze, carved in wood. Of course, all his mounts were, after he established his proprietary style, his method of mounting fish, he carved for every one of them. And I think that's how I see her the most. Not so much as the Lothario or the incredible showman that he was, or the guide or the championship cast. Those things are wonderful stories, but I always come back to his art.
Absolutely. And so you just tossed out, there were so many facets to this guy.
Yes.
You probably couldn't contain everything that there is to be said about him. Certainly within
there could have been a volume 2 on Herb Welch.
On Herb Welch.
Sure.
But for the fly fishing audience, the thing that they're going to immediately recognize, or maybe not, and they should, was that he was the inventor of a fly. Correct me if I'm wrong. 1 year before Carrie Stevens really caught the big fish in 1924. I believe Herb tied the Black Ghost in 1923.
So there's a 23 date and there's a 27 date.
Yeah, let's flush that out.
Well, it got out there in the stratosphere that it was 1923, and I think that might have been Bates, which means it could have come from anywhere. Although Joe Bates did have a relationship with Herb Welch, in so much as Herb would allow it. But I think through our research, I really think that 27 date might be the more accurate one. And fly origination, unless it's written down specifically and notarized with, a bloodstained fingerprint, I don't really feel super good about it, right? Because there's vagaries and there's all kinds of convergent evolution and stuff like that. But so within that span, it's safe to say that either just prior to or just after the Black Ghost, and as you were saying, the Gray Ghost, in its form of development too, that was a developed fly. It didn't just come out of the vise, right? They were kissing cousins for sure.
Right. And coming around the same time.
And a fascinating thing about that is, so Carrie Stevens sold flies through Herb Welch's shop.
Exactly.
Right? We'd established that. So he would mail her orders, and they would go in the winter across by dog sled with Fred Fowler, or they would go by steamer. And he ordered a bunch of Black Ghosts from her to tie for the store. And she was like, oh, I'd be happy to tie them if you could send me the pattern. I'm unfamiliar with this fly. So she's literally like 11 miles away, across this lake. And she had never heard of the fly. And I think that's fascinating. So his Black Ghost, which was immediately a huge success,
Right.
and very popular,
Right.
and was no doubt being fished at Upper Dam, it didn't enter her world until he specifically asked her for it. And then she had to ask for the dressing.
What if there's any evidence of a transaction receipt where a Black Ghost got bought in 23, or we know the Gray Ghost, when that was, like you said, the first iteration of it, was certainly not what we think of it now. It probably didn't have jungle cock on the eye. It might not have had silver pheasant cheek or any of that. The first fly, as you chronicled in the Carrie Stevens book, looked very different than the Gray Ghost that we think of now.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense when you think of anybody's development as a fly tire. Our first works are they're not so great, and you're dissatisfied with them. And my fly's riding upside down. Well, why is that? Oh, well, I've got this in the wrong spot. It's too heavy here. Or I need to balance this portion out with this. So yeah, and of course there's the debate about the Gray Ghost because it was named the Gray Ghost later. And I know we're on Herb now, but its first development was a pattern called, its name was the Shangs Go Get 'em, right? Which is important to mention because the legend is that the Gray Ghost was tied and she went to the pool, caught this fish.
Right. No.
So she did tie a fly and she did go to the pool and she did catch this big fish, but that wasn't that probably was not the final iteration of that dressing.
Right.
Yeah. And that's,
Only
and that's cool.
She named the predecessor pattern the Gray Ghost later on down the line.
She did not apply that name. That was from a client friend of hers who stayed at the Upper Dam Hotel. His name is Frank Bugby. There's a fun cocktail party found.
I love all of this, Leslie. With her, you and I, in talking about him before, you mentioned his tying style was different than Carrie's.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, quite. So whereas Mrs. Stevens, once she had established her method, that was her method.
Consistent.
Beautifully consistent. Very feminine, flies very draped. Very evocative of a natural, moving, curving thing. Herb's flies, I just think he cared a little bit less about the act of fly tying. If you asked Mr. Welch to sit down and tie you half a dozen Jane Craigs, one of his really popular patterns, or the Black Ghost, let's use that one because it's the most popular. I think you'd have 6 different iterations of a Black Ghost.
Yeah.
They'd all have white wings and they'd all have black bodies. And they'd all have yellow tails and throats and jungle cock atoms. But boy, they would not line up like they came off the belt.
No, and even the original Black Ghosts that you see, like you say, not only are they not the same proportionately, but sometimes there's another material or missing or added. Do you remember seeing Herb Welch flies that were maybe not as consistent in terms of the recipe? I have seen them. I've been fortunate enough to own several and to curate and record on others' collections. And he preferred yellow hackle for the tail and throat. I can use this yellow pheasant feather too. Sure. And he wasn't a slave to that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And even the best of tires have to work with what they have sometimes. If you've got an order to fill, then fill the order, right? Right. This is money.
Yeah.
And a lot of that went on. And any practical commercial fly tire today, sometimes you have to make allowances for the quality of something you can get, or maybe you just can't get it. Maybe you just can't. Like with jungle cock over the years, there was all these false types of jungle cock, whether it was a plastic bilar sheet that was stamped out, or a starling feather, a body feather that had 2 dots painted on it, or a slip of wood duck in place of where the eye would be, where the cheek would be rather, to simulate the eye. All tires do that. But Herb he could tie with the best of them, but his method was a little cruder, and he would not lose any sleep over the overall look of the fly. It's gonna catch a fish.
Yeah.
It's gonna.
It's black and white.
Yeah.
So it's going to show up in all light.
Literally. Yeah, it's a black and white fly.
Well, literally it's a black and white fly, but from a guiding perspective, we have this mantra, bright day, bright fly, dark day, dark fly.
Except for everybody else who's like bright day, dark fly. So
No, that still plays into the hands of the black ghost.
it certainly does.
Because
Can't go wrong.
No, you can't go wrong. It's a great fly to start with, and very, Phil Foster, who was a pretty popular guide. Oh, in the farm, Phil Foster? Yeah, great tire as well.
The silver downeaster.
So Phil would say to me when I was first getting going with guiding, really getting busy with guiding in my 20s, I would say, Phil, gun to your head. If you had to start the day out with a fly, what would it be? Unequivocally, no apprehension in his voice, black ghost marabou.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think I still, at the time of the writing, we had made an inquiry to Beans. I believe that was the number one selling streamer.
Yeah.
But that's to this day, it's an elemental pattern.
Yeah, I think that people, I know I myself will tie on a gray ghost probably a little quicker than a black ghost, but I still fish a black ghost. I fished it 2 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful pattern. So let's go back because the podcast is about Herb. You and your dad had such success with the Carrie Stevens book, first released in 2000. 2018, you released the Herb Welch book. What happened? I know we talked about the Stan Bogdan book.
Yep.
So, but to stay on topic, what was going on that was helping you guys to think about the first steps of the Herb Welch book, and what went along chronologically in order for you to feel like you were ready to release?
Sure.
More like the writing of the book, if you know what I'm saying.
Yep.
Yeah.
I do. As you're going along and you're doing research on a specific thing, all these other factors come in peripherally.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really difficult to talk to other people about Carrie Stevens and not have Herb Welch come into the conversation from some angle, like that little fly sale anecdote. So you're going along and all of a sudden you're amassing enough information. And after the success of Carrie Stevens, we'd always known about Herb Welch. Obviously, he lived right down the street from us. But this figure is larger than life. And he is. He was, pardon me. And there's a fantastic story there. You just have to make it coalesce into some kind of progressive story. So it was really easy to find information on Herb. The New York Times.
Right. I was imagining the magazines are writing about it.
When they were in Madison Square Garden for 12 days, selling out the show every day.
Yeah.
What an era. And they clean up the elephant poop from the circus that was just there, and in would come the sportsman show. And for 2 weeks almost, they would be there selling out that show. And articles were written all the time. There was a whole sporting section devoted in almost every newspaper of the day to just sporting. So, all this information gets out there.
And how was Herb? I'm thinking fly casting demonstrations.
Yeah, he was. So, a lot of credit is justifiably given to Cornelia Fly Rod Crosby as the touring showman for the state of Maine. And indeed, she put it on the map in terms of the show circuit with her state of Maine booth at the sportsman shows. And Herb followed in that very same vein. By the 30s and the 40s, we had several different forms of media available to us, radio, and shortly thereafter, in the 50s, everybody was starting to get a television and things could be filmed, broadcast, and Herb would go up there and just hold court. He was already a casting distance champion, so he had this wonderful routine with Chief Nadaba, depending on the proper pronunciation. That's my Abenaki or my Passamaquoddy is not so good. Forgive me there. But they would have this wonderful routine shtick where Herb would cast at the show, and the hall was lined up full of people. He would write his name with the fly line on the ground. He'd loop it and make an H, and then he'd loop it and make a cursive E. And then they'd do the whole thing. And then the chief would always come in, Herb, you forgot to dot the I. Or he'd go, oh, thank you, Chief, thank you. And he'd go back and do whatever, flick of the wrist he was capable. I don't know how he did it. He'd dot the I.
But he was a showman.
He was a wicked showman. He was a male model. He did radio ads. He did ads for Chesterfield and for Willie's Jeeps and all this stuff. And tourism boards. They would come through and film him doing his thing.
He was a handsome guy.
He was.
Thin, tall, strong.
Yeah, Aqualine featured. Strong French-Canadian lilt to him, dark-skinned, beautiful big eyes. and, athletic, an outdoorsman,
Mhm.
of course. And he was, again, I did not know Mr. Welch. He died in 1960 before I was born, but he's very charming. He had, he's reported a bit of a Lothario. It's no mistake that he has flies named the Jane Craig or the Jane Grey. These were very popular vaudevillian actresses at the time that he would often be in the company of.
A ladies' man.
Yes,
Yeah.
by all accounts.
So what were the challenges in writing the book?
How big could the book be?
Right. Right.
Publishers have budgets, and the landscape and the publishing world had really changed in those 18 years before our first Stackpole publication and this one. So some stuff had to get parsed down. There were topics that we absolutely wanted to cover. There was, we wanted to include one of the really wonderful aspects of my father's writing, because he was the primary writer, was these controlled tangents that he would like to have in a story time, in a storyline. And one of them was the history of taxidermy. So Herb Welch's taxidermy is one of his most famous forms of art that he produced, right?
More specifically, was he doing deer and fish?
So he started off his early career mounting whatever, put up the squirrel for me, kid. You got it, sir. Pick it up on Thursday. Yeah, whatever it took, right? Because you're paying bills and you're working for somebody else too. But later on in life, he didn't do mammal work. He was strictly fish.
And that's kind of what people are finding. If you were to go into the museum in Oquossoc, you would find a Herb Welch brook trout.
You certainly would.
Yeah. And did you say he was a carver as well as doing traditional taxidermy?
Yeah.
So he would carve fish. Would he put the skin over them? What did you find?
He would, as was common in the day, you would skin the fish along the side that was not going to be presented.
Yep.
So you wouldn't skin a fish up the belly, because you would have to stitch that and it would show, because you can see the belly on a mounted fish. So you would always do the backside. You say, I want it facing the left, or I want it facing the right. Okay. So you skin it thusly, remove the skin, cure it in whatever manner that he was curing it, whatever he used, whether it was straight salt or a borax composition of some sort, or perhaps a professional taxidermy chemical. A lot of our receipts from the collection have any number of taxidermy house supply houses setting stuff. And then he would look at that individual fish, brook trout, salmon, togue, whatever it was, and he would carve out of white cedar the form for that fish. So white cedar is really important. That it was white cedar is really important. It's a very benign wood. It has natural insect repellent qualities. They don't like it. And it's light, super lightweight. And it has a really low tannin structure. So it would not pump out into the skin of the fish. Tannins, which are harmful, they cause things to erode. They impart things. Like, it's wonderful in a Chardonnay, tannins, but not so much on a fish mouth, right?
Right.
And he would then stretch that over the carved form. And he would later on in life, in his career, he would do this sinuous shape, so the fish looked like it was swimming, alive. And then he would stitch it up, set the eye in wax and the glass eye, and paint it.
Amazing.
And that would be the thing.
Was there any evidence did he apprenticed under anybody? Oh yeah, he had done.
Absolutely. For Mr. Hines out of Portland, Aurelius Hines. And that's an interesting story. It's in the book. And he was walking by a window one day of his shop, and he was like, I bet I could do that. And he went in and he just started talking to him, and yeah, sure, kid. Stick with me. I'll make you a star. And, that's conjecture, but, he just, I can do that.
So outside of the sporting, doing taxidermy and fly tying, you guys were able to discover, and Herb Welch was known as an athlete.
Yep, he was. Yeah. He was an athlete. He played a lot of school baseball and basketball, and his father was a horse breaker. So I think it's inconceivable to think that he wasn't a horseman as well, just by nature of helping his father.
Mm-hmm.
And I have old photos of him canoeing out here, and he would often enter whitewater races. Certainly could swim, I know that.
Yeah, it seemed very competitive.
Yes, he was a competitive person.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you want to consider fly casting as an athletic endeavor, he certainly had that under his belt as well.
Yeah. Did Herb have any affiliation with a particular builder? Or was he building his own rods? Or
We've never seen any example of him building cane rods.
Yeah.
Um,
Did he have a collection that you guys were able to?
no, I don't.
No.
No, not his flies.
Right.
I have a friend who has his wallet. I have many of his flies, and those are obtainable. But whether or not he was a Thomas rod guy or he liked Ken Crocker's rods right here in town or any of that, I'm sure he fished Thomas rods. Everybody did.
Yeah.
Gene Edwards probably pushed a few quadrates through the shop here and there. He sold a lot of Shakespeare stuff.
I'm trying to picture when this shop would have been in existence. Herb's tackle shop.
Oh, well, he ran it almost up until his death.
Right.
In 1960.
Okay.
And, but I think it was founded, when was that founded? Late 20s, I think it was.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, a long time.
So 40 years as a
Yep.
retail structure right here in Oquossoc.
Right downtown.
Yeah.
Right at the corner of Bald Mountain Road.
Right. So if you think about the history of the sport, a lot of changes were going on. So Shakespeare, he might have been one of the first places you could buy a fiberglass rod in the Rangeley area.
Yep. I know for a fact that we have receipts of him selling a Wonder Rod.
Right.
Remember those
Yeah.
horrible white,
Yeah.
all white fiberglass, like limp piece of spaghetti?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Thomas rods. So, there's that, like you're saying, that was a period of great change in the industry.
Yeah.
There were all sorts of new materials coming into play. The war was going on, and then the war was over,
Mhm.
and new avenues for the application of these materials needed to be found. So fiberglass became that replaced everything. He sold hardy stuff. But his physical stuff, what he preferred, couldn't tell you.
Yeah. Well, that's how it goes. Well, I think we come to a good place to take a break. Love to come back, talk more about Herb Welch and
bet.
some of the other things that you learned in doing the research for the book.
Be my pleasure.
For this Flyline flashback, let's take a moment to paddle back in time and explore the incredible history of the Old Town Canoe Company. Starting in 1898 in Old Town, Maine, this iconic company began its journey crafting canvas-covered wooden canoes in a repurposed shoe factory. By 1901, Old Town was officially incorporated. Fast forward to 1917, and Old Town was ahead of the curve, introducing a square-stern canoe designed for the new detachable motor craze. By 1923, they went full throttle, becoming the first distributor of Johnson outboard motors. Old Town wasn't just about canoes, it was about adventure. In 1972, their classic 16-foot guide models hit the big screen in the film Deliverance, starring Burt Reynolds and Jon Voight. 7 canoes were used in the movie, further cementing their place in pop culture. But here's where things get really fun. In the early 1970s, Old Town introduced Royalex, or Altanar as they called it, a super tough ABS composite plastic that competed with aluminum and fiberglass. To prove how indestructible their new model was, they pulled off an unforgettable marketing stunt called the Gimmick. They tossed their new Royalex Tripper canoe off the factory roof. It hit the ground, folded in half, and then, like magic, sprung back to its original shape. Their takeaway? That the canoe could not fly, but it sure could take a beating. They even joked that it was like a banana that wouldn't split. In 1995, Old Town expanded into kayak manufacturing, and by 2000, they were making more kayaks than canoes. Despite changing times, this iconic Maine company stayed true to its roots, continuing to innovate while keeping production in Maine. Thanks to some creative funding and a purchase of the company by Johnson Outdoors in 2004. From crafting legendary canoes to starring in films and revolutionizing the paddle sports industry, Old Town Canoe has become a household name and a national treasure. It's not just a company, it's a symbol of Maine's enduring spirit. And now, back to the second half of our episode.
So this was actually a debate between Father and I. There's a murder mystery in the book.
Oh.
Who killed Otis Bean? Otis Bean was a guide here at the landing, and one day he was shot right out back here in a barn, 38 Special. and murdered. And who done it? And it's the ultimate cold case. They could never find out who did it. Herb took the stand. Mrs. Bean took the stand. The relationship between Dorothy Voorhees, Herb's second wife, and Herb and Mrs. Bean was much discussed. So I'll let you read about that. But that's a great, fun little cold case topic. And Father and I had this debate. I'm like, Dad, I'm telling you, why do you want to put this in the book? You know, I thought it was a great story, but you'll see there's a chunk devoted to that story. So we had a little back and forth about this because I wanted to put other stuff in the book, like more fishing stuff and more, art stuff and all that. And he's like, no, I think we've covered that really well. I think there's enough here, and I just wasn't really down.
No, I love the folklore stuff. So he was being accused potentially of murder. Murder in Oquossoc, Maine. And what did you guys learn? What was it? I mean, was he having an affair? I mean, meaning Herb.
Sure he was having an affair with Mrs. Bean.
Yeah.
I'm sure of it.
Yeah.
And whether Dorothy knew about it and was involved with it, I don't know.
Okay.
But she and Mrs. Bean were pals. But it wouldn't be the first time somebody slept with their wife's pal, right?
Right.
They had her locked up. I mean, they didn't just put her on the stand. They had her locked up. And there were two brothers who were wanderers, and they got locked up. And they could never get it. They could never pin it on anybody.
And your dad really felt like this needed to be included in the book.
Yeah. And he was right. It's a great story. It's
Yep.
great. We've gotten so much positive feedback from it. I was just like, this is cold case shit.
No, but it's great.
But it's a great story. It's a great story.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
Oquossoc is a tiny place. I mean, obviously a lot of people travel through here, but Herb was
He had bumper stickers pretty loud. Who shot Otis Bean?
Your dad did?
Yeah. I'll try and find you one.
That's a nod to try to get the attention of any sporting buffs, I guess.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Hilarious.
Oh, people would stop us all the time. Well, who did shoot Otis Bean? Well, I mean,
and it was unsolved. It remained unsolved.
It remains unsolved.
So Otis Bean, was he a competing guide in the area?
Well, he was a guide, but nobody competed with Herb Welch. Nobody competed with Herb. I mean, if you wanted to guide, when the presidents came to town, Herb guided the presidents.
Who did he guide? Do we know who?
He guided Hoover. He guided Eisenhower. So that's Ethel right there. This is 23.
The murder.
Mrs. Bean arrested for murder of her husband. Woodsman not indicted. So freed on murder charge. Norman Mawson and Jeremiah Wheat.
So what's going on here is Leslie's looking at the book right now,
Yeah.
reminding himself of this folklore. Not even folklore. It's true. It's just an unsolved murder.
No, just they never could figure it out.
But Herb was roped in on this as a potential.
Yeah. He was involved. He was a person of interest, I think.
Person of interest.
I think that was the term.
Yeah.
The court here, as I read from the last paragraph here, the court proceedings included the grilling of Herb Welch, who had sold the murder weapon and been first on the scene. Even more interesting for the crowds was the testimony of Miss Elsie Stewart, described by the press as the Queen of Pleasant Island, where Otis worked. Cross-examination by the defense could not shake her testimony that Otis Bean was in her company the greater part of the previous summer. So what was going on with Mr. Bean?
I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's the Wild West right here up in Rangeland, Maine.
Oh, well.
And Herb was one of the gunslingers, sounds like.
Yeah, it gets funny.
Let's talk about his art.
Okay.
Yeah, I know he was recognized as a painter.
Mm-hmm.
What did you learn?
Well, we were really fortunate. So I told you my father's a collector of many things, and art is probably the primary thing in the collection to this day. So we knew a bit about art and what made for good technique. Whether or not you like art is highly subjective, right? Mm-hmm. That's the beautiful thing about it. But with Herb, he was classically trained. And we were very friendly with, I think, the foremost wildlife artist in America today, John Swan. John has several homes here in the state, but we always interacted with John at his old family camp up on Kennebec. He had his studio, and visiting him there and listening to him talk about art and technique and what he could see and what he could glean. Because you need someone who does this to truly understand it. I can talk to you about fly tying techniques all day, but I can't talk to you about brush strokes.
Leslie, did John Swan have a property on Bemis Track?
I don't know.
I went to his studio at one point. I thought it was on Bemis Track and bought a piece from him. This would have been 35 years ago. He was a painter, John Swan.
Still is.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted
not at all.
because I feel like I met him.
No, John's
Very accessible person.
well. When he wants to be accessed, he will be accessed.
I mean, we see his art is what I'm trying to
Oh,
say.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And he's brilliant. And
Yeah.
his command of, I don't know, John's just,
Right.
we're fortunate to breathe the same air as
Yeah.
people like Mr. Swan. And he helped us, he critiqued all of the pieces in the book and helped us break them down. And they're his words. Because like I said, sometimes you got to bring in the ringer, and John was brilliant. So in his words in the book, and not to defer or to stump for book sales, but I won't do it justice. But Herb's work was whatever he wanted to paint, he would paint. So classically trained, very fond of the female figure. So there were a lot of nudes, but that was very common. Of course, it still is. The human form is probably one of the more difficult things to study and to train to paint well. He would occasionally paint wildlife, but he was a very good landscape artist. And some of my favorite pieces are indeed landscapes.
Do we know where Herb Welch grew up?
Yes, we do. Yeah, in Maine, in Portland. That's where he went to school, and then he came up here at an early age. And when I say early age, I mean he was like 18.
Yeah,
he was young. He was a young man.
Do we know what brought him to the area?
I think it was Mr. Hines. I think it was the sporting life and the work.
And that turned into a natural passion for being in the outdoors, hunting.
Yeah, I think he'd had that since the get-go.
He did.
Yeah,
it gave him a avenue to use it.
Well, this was where this was happening. This was on the come.
Right.
Ranger was being established. Oquossoc had the rail line. It was great sport right out your door.
Mm.
It was an easy place to go and try and make a mark.
You mentioned something earlier, and I didn't want to interrupt, but when you were talking about Cornelia Flyrod Crosby and she was going to the exhibitions and promoting the state, she was working under the guise of the railway.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's get to Herb Welch. This is going on in the 30s and 40s. He's doing casting demonstrations at the shows. Was there any evidence as to who was sponsoring him, or was he just doing this to promote his own guiding in his retail business, or any sense of?
Yeah. So, he would, like I said, he would take work at the behest of others, but he would be the central figure. So like we have a wonderful advertisement for him promoting Willie's Jeeps for a local dealership.
Got it.
Right. So while you're getting a few bucks for that, right. Or for Chesterfield cigarettes or those types of things. So those are, I don't know if you would really call them sponsors or employers, right? And they're hiring you to do this thing. As far as the show circuit thing, I mean, these are big productions. And so somebody obviously brought him in,
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, Herb didn't compete with very many people. Herb was the man. So if the president was in town and needed to be guided, he would be guided. If his good friend Ted Williams needed a tip on where to go when he was in the region, Herb would go with him. And they would, and he and Ted would be at the shows together too. That always caused an uproar anywhere Ted Williams went. And he hung out with the right people just by virtue of being himself.
Do you think that there was a point, or in doing research for the book, was there a point where it was his breaking point? It was his aha moment. Did he catch a big fish? Did he, obviously he guided presidents, but going from a fledgling guide artist to becoming who he ultimately became in Maine sporting history,
yes.
Was there an aha moment? Or is it just a multitude?
No, I think it's a multitude of things that are very closely allied. I mean, Carrie Stevens caught the big trout.
That's my point.
Boom.
That's
right?
my point.
National exposure.
Yeah.
Now, words out. Herb was doing all these things and doing them super well.
Yeah.
And his taxidermy I mean, you've seen the trout in the other camp.
Yeah.
One of those trout is almost 100 years old. And it's showing some signs of wear.
But
let me tell you, you'd be happy to have that trout. And so the skill and the artistry really, really, I think all of it just came together. And don't forget where he was.
right. So he was
right here.
Yeah,
And the world was coming through here.
he was here, but he also was doing. I mean, we were just looking over lunch. So Herb Welch's trout, 100 years old, is sitting on the wall mounted next to a Dave Footer mount, which might be 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they look to be in similar condition. And you think Dave Footer was in probably a very well lit studio. Okay. And Herb Welch was in a poorly lit, under oil lamps and wood fire.
As we sit here in this camp, let me tell you something about bad lighting. Okay.
Yeah.
But Dave Footer did not have the grandest of studios. And the light he worked under was down in Lewiston on Golder Road. It wasn't exactly a surgical room. But don't forget, Dave Footer was Herb Welch's acolyte.
Right. Dave Footer sat at the feet of Herb Welch.
Yes, he did.
He learned from Herb Welch.
He did. And Dave and Polly came up when they were just very young, just married, I believe, if I've got that part of the story corrected, and went to Mr. Welch and showed him some taxidermy that Dave had done on his own, some of his first fish. And Mr. Welch was like, nice, keep at it, kid. You might be on to something. But then he saw a painting that David had done. That's what turned Herb's head and said, oh, the kid's got it. Wasn't the beginning, it wasn't the first mount that he saw.
Yeah.
Dave. It was a painting that David had done.
So one of the things that David Footer did, and you have in your example on the wall, was he would have an oil painting and then he'd have a fish mount placed in front of it. So it might be a background of little Minipie and Labrador as an example. And then you've got the fish mount in front of it. Did Herb do, was there any research that you and your father turned up that showed he was doing a similar?
Precisely the same. Dave took that from Herb.
That's why I asked.
Yep.
Yeah. So that was not an original artistic direction that David took. Dave took that from Herb.
Yes. And nor was it Herb who did that first either. Don't forget, taxidermy is you want to go back to Egypt? Mummies are taxidermy.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and the Victorians, my gosh.
But if we were to just stick within the sporting confines of
fishing.
within
the sporting confines of fishing, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Or any small hunting scene too.
Yeah.
Dioramas are an excellent example of this, right? Those are very often backboard painted.
Just for my own clarification, what is a diorama?
Oh, a diorama is generally on not always on a smaller scale, but often. And it's essentially a box. A diorama is a boxed scene. Anybody that had to do a small model reconstruction out of styrofoam balls of the solar system in third grade has probably made a shoebox diorama, right? You remember that?
Absolutely. Now you put it in
that's a diorama.
Now you put it in those
and
terms.
not all dioramas are created equal. So,
so give me an example of a sporting diorama that you've seen.
Well, they can be very simple. Like they can be like those Carey Stevens flies over there mounted. Just like that.
Like a shadow box.
Yeah,
if you would.
Shadow box is a more contemporary term for a diorama. But it may diverge in that a diorama generally it involves a scene.
Okay.
Like there's something going on. So that fish that is mounted with that beautiful back setting of the water in which it was caught that's painted on the backboard, if that was a little more enclosed, we could call that a diorama.
Understood.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's just mounted on a board. And that's been a long time coming. But Herb and Dave Footer did it a lot better than most.
So I'm thinking that Dave Footer did a fair amount of his taxidermy behind a glass bubble. It was protected.
He did a lot of it under domes, but you had to request it. They weren't all like automatically done under glass.
And I know that a lot of the old fish mounts that we think of from Rangeley area, did you find any Herb Welch work that was behind glass at all?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The library downtown has a stunning fish.
Of Herb Welch.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And well, oh my gosh, perhaps the greatest example of trout under glass is the Carrie Stevens trout at the museum, the 6 pound, 13 ounce.
Right. The one that basically broke her career when she caught that fish.
Yep.
And was recognized for that. She went to Herb to have it mounted.
Yep. She sure did.
And he did it.
He did it. What I love most about that trout. Okay. So it's 6 pound, 13 ounces. So that's a pig of a fish, right?
Yeah.
Even in 1924, when she caught it, that was a really big fish at Upper Dam.
Yeah, one had not been caught in 10 years.
Yeah, some such thing. I think the previous one that season, the biggest one was like 3 pounds or something, which is great today. But back then, that was already kind of the zenith because we'd impacted the fishery so much. So with that Welch trout at the museum, underneath it, he mounts kind of what you would say is a regular trout. It's like an 11 or 12 inch brook trout underneath it, just straight right below the big fish.
Right.
For scale. And it's like, oh, okay, that's a big old fish. But that dome is that fish. See, there's inherent problems with domed fish. You've created a terrarium. So if that fish is hanging on the wall right there, and that window is where it is, and the path of the sun is going to bring 30 minutes of direct light on that fish in a glass bubble a day for how many years? Man, now you've got trouble. Because, you can, all the white cedar you want to use is great. All the great non-reactive paints, great. All that stuff's important, but nothing beats the sun. We can't escape the torches of the sun. So those domes
magnify
when
light.
Yeah, all of a sudden, your room is 75 degrees and it's 90 inside that dome.
Right. The temperature, not only just the light being magnified, but the temperature being...
All that stuff comes into play.
Sure.
And heaven forbid a little bit of moisture should get in there by whatever means.
Sure.
Because then it just, blooms away and create a terrarium.
Yeah.
I just had a friend that I helped procure a Welch mount that was an absolutely magnificent fish. And it was on a big square frame. Beautiful bird's eye maple frame and a mahogany backboard. And it had been set over a glass dome. But at some point in its life, and this happens a lot, the dome failed. They either crack from tension or they get bumped or dropped or mishandled in some fashion, and it cracks. And we really, really struggled to get a replacement dome. This was a massive piece. I think overall the piece was like 42 inches from edge to edge. The fish wasn't obviously that big. And we finally were able to locate a Lexan or plexiglass.
Sure.
Yeah, that's the right term.
Yep.
But he was like, no way, it's got to be glass. Oh my Lord. Okay. So the hunt went on and we were able to find one on another old mount that the fish had failed in. The fish had broken up, just, old plaster cast fish. Right?
But the glass dome was
the dome was good. So we were able to procure that mount for kind of just a song because the fish was destroyed. And he himself very, very proficiently transferred that to his fish and just repleted the seams. Gorgeous. Stunning. So we wrote a book on Carrie Stevens and that brought us to Herbie Welch. And we wanted to do that. But in the meantime, my father wrote the book on Stan Bogdan. Herb Welch sold the first Bogdan reel. This is the greatest sports photo in the history of New England Boston sports. Okay. Big salmons with Bogdans, Bobby Orr and Ted Williams and the guide.
So what we're looking at for the audience is we've got the Stan Bogdan book opened up with, you tell a story. What are we seeing?
Well, so this is in between Carrie Stevens and Herb Welch. My father was asked to write the biography on Stan Bogdan, and you didn't say no to that opportunity. What a hoot to write this book for my father. I was involved very peripherally, as I said earlier. So here's the subject is alive. The subject is a phone call or an hour and 20-minute drive away. So we spent a lot of time with Stan, and he had all this great stuff and all these photographs. And in this photo, supporting on a rod 3 massive Atlantic salmon. And on either end is Bobby Orr, and on the other end is Ted Williams. Both proud Bogdan owners.
And in the middle.
And in the middle is their guide, their middle camp host, Roger Bikey, showing off the magnificent Grand Cascapedia salmon. Stan Bogdan was good friends with Herb Welch. He was friends with another camp owner down the way, and he came in and was introduced to Herb, and they hit it off. And Herb Welch, out of his shop here in Oquossoc, sold the first Bogdan reel.
So for the audience, Stan Bogdan really was the inventor of the modern, at the time, Atlantic salmon reel. These reels were made out of machined aluminum. They were some of the finest that you could buy. They are the high watermark of Atlantic salmon reels.
Certainly.
Maybe some more modern designs have come that are replacing it, but for the longest time, anybody who was anybody, Ted Williams or anybody, had a Bogdan reel. And you're telling me that the first one was sold out of Herb Welch's?
Not a word of it a lie.
Wow. Amazing.
Isn't that cool?
And this all came out in the research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, through Stan. I mean, Stan's like, oh yeah. And this was so funny about Stan. You'd be going through, he had boxes. God, he was a great Yankee. Never threw a damn thing away, right? Just boxes of ephemera and catalogs and menus from sporting camps and all of it, right? And you'd be going through something and you find this epiphanal piece of information that just cast light on 1,000 theories. And Stan would go, oh yeah, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, I was the first man on the moon, or just whatever it was. Stan was like that.
Yeah. Well, you must have gotten so much satisfaction out of the time you spent researching both the Carrie Stevens book and the Herb Welch book. I would like, before we close out, to talk about the museum here in Oquossoc.
Oh.
And it's gone underneath several different names and iterations, but
a
now
little bit of rebranding, yes. But
rebranding.
But the mission is the same.
And let's talk about Herb Welch in the museum. What do you know about what they have over there for pieces?
Well, they've got some wonderful pieces. So Herb was really, a very broad field of interest that shaped his life. So over the years, they have had his, did I mention that he was a track cyclist? You know how popular track cycling was around the turn of the last century, and all major cities had velocidomes?
Yes.
Right? Herb did that. So his bike was there for years and years and years. That has since returned to the family. That was a loaner. But they have a wonderful collection of his mounts, a replica of his workstation there, which is very telling. There's a wonderful movie that runs on a reel, one of those promotional pieces that he did for the state or the nation, any number of artifacts and logs and a series of displays that show the construction of a fish mount, him skinning a fish on tape, stuff like that. Really just wonderful stuff. It really, really tells a nice story about his work.
And Bill's shown me he had a vest that he wore during his casting demo.
Bill Pierce?
Yeah.
Do that? Yeah. Yes.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah. I believe on the back of it says the 100 Footers Club. Or
100 Footers Club?
Yeah. And we tried to recreate that one year. We did a Herb Welch conclave there, Dad and I, and we'd done a couple of these for Carrie Stevens, and they were really successful days for the museum. We had a lot of fun. And we set up a casting platform outside, and we tried to get anybody that was able to cast 100 feet. No shooting heads, no double hauling allowed, all this stuff. And it was kind of a bust. You may find this hard to believe, but it was very windy. For the listener at home, it's blowing a gale outside right now. So we had a horribly windy day. But we did have one young woman who came up, young girl. She was probably all 14. And I never got her name. Bill probably wrote it down somewhere, but she stepped up there and she had learned to fly cast like the previous weekend. And damn that kid, she almost made it.
Yeah.
She almost laid out 100 feet. And 100 feet's 100 feet.
That's long.
That's a long. Yeah. And this is just a kid who she just had it. She just had, it was like, oh, I should have been doing this forever.
I'm noticing you're saying she, because women are
always the best casters.
Always the best casters.
Always.
Yeah.
And almost always the best flight times.
Yeah.
I mean, how many people have you taught to fly cast? I've taught a few dozen easy, and I would sometimes take out families. And the dad, firstborn son, worst. I'm gonna cast with 200 feet. The muscle, no finesse, nothing, not a touch to him. And the mom and the young girl might be there. They just, because casting's a delicate thing.
It is.
It's a timing thing.
It requires feel.
It's a patient thing.
Yeah. Well, I think he'd also, back to Herb Welch.
But he had that vest, and it's a charming piece of
sporting.
It's not ephemera. It's just cool. Yes.
So were the artifacts from Herb Welch's, did they get past? I mean, he didn't have children. So how were these things maintained? What did you find about that?
So
what did you learn?
So he did have some nephews and nieces, and they became the stewards of them, particularly the one that I'm very friendly with. And he has always been as careful about them as he can. Keeps them under lock and key. Sure. It's one of those things where they're just completely irreplaceable.
Yeah. So did they ever loan them to the museum? Or
some of the stuff was loaned to the museum, and then during the previous regime change that we had there, some items were returned.
Understood.
Yeah, it asked to be returned.
Got it.
But things are just bright as rain down there today. Michelle Landry, the new director, I think she's just a fabulous job. I was involved with several festivals they had this summer, and the outpouring from the public to these events, I was blown away.
Yeah, well,
they were super, super well attended, and we've done. I attended myself several lectures that they'd done. They had their annual meeting on the grounds of Bald Mountain Camp, one of the last great old line camps down the way here, and it was a wonderful conversation after that. That was so well attended. Yes.
But we've really seen a development. I mean, there was no museum 25 years ago, right?
Not 25, but we're getting close.
We're getting close, right? You and your father had not written the books on Carrie Stevens and Herb Welch, and now all of this exists. So it's like we talked about the lantern created and the moths flying to it. The museum is wildly popular now.
Sure, it is. It is wildly popular, but it really. I'd be remiss not to mention that, we didn't start this.
No, you were a part of it.
Sure. And it's fun to be a part of that in my era, in the era in which I live, right? But, what about Captain Barker, who wrote his famous works and chronicled his life up here? And, what about all the writings that Cornelia Crosby did to promote the region? And Joseph Bates, with all his works coming out of Longmeadow, Massachusetts, about the entire state. And fishing in general, but he loved the range days,
Yeah.
These things there's a lot of people involved in this, and it matters. It matters to remember that it's wonderful that in this day and age of social media and all other non-media social media forms of communicating that we have, that these institutions matter. The museum is a physical place. Go there and see the stuff. Reach out. Some of the stuff is tactile. Yeah. Not all of it. Keep your hands off most of it. But you know what I mean? It's right there. If you need to see 100 immaculate Carrie Stevens flies, there they are, 4 inches from your face.
Isn't that great?
It's awesome.
Yeah.
It's awesome, and it's rare.
Yeah.
And the books their gift shop. Contemporary works.
Well,
People still publishing, private press, major publishing. The topics are. I do not despair about this with the younger generations. People talk about, kids aren't interested in this stuff. No way. Totally interested in it.
Very much. And I have, in that same regard, the museum is not open today, but coming and visiting with you today and putting an original Herb Welch Black Ghost in my hands and looking firsthand while we're eating lunch at a Herb Welch 100-year-old brook trout piece of taxidermy. Thank you for providing that opportunity for me. And we're gonna have all this on the blog page of this episode to enjoy. And it means everything that you took the time to share, both regarding Carrie Stevens and Herb Welch. And thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. My pleasure. Thank you both.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us for this intimate discussion, and thank you for listening to Flyline Podcast. A new Flyline Podcast episode will be released every 2 weeks on Tuesdays, so be sure to come back to meet our next famous guest. Until then, this is Michael Jones, and we invite you to visit the blog section of our website to enjoy photos and contributions from our guests and experience all of our episodes at flylinepodcast.com.